Welcome to the MSL 411, a podcast designed to equip both aspiring and experienced MSLs with the resources they need to level up their career toolkit. The heart of this podcast is to take the same industry knowledge and advice that we share with our own candidates and make it available and accessible to anyone looking for answers. So if you have questions, you've come to the right place. We're here to give you the 411. And without further ado, let's dive right in. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the MSL 411 podcast. I am really excited about today's episode. Today I am joined by a special guest, Johnathan Pinkhasov, who is a PharmD, an MBA, and a medical affairs leader with nearly a decade of experience in neurology and rare disease. He is someone who has navigated his fair share of transitions, company transitions throughout his career, and he brings a unique and really thoughtful, strategic perspective on growth, change, and long-term success as an MSL, what that looks like, and how he has navigated that personally. So, Johnathan, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the opportunity to kind of talk about my experience, Linda.
Well, I think this is going to resonate with a lot of people in medical affairs with the transition piece. A lot of people have gone through that or are maybe fearful that they may go through that someday. And so I think hearing your real talk on that topic, plus all the other aspects of MSL life that you are so well versed in, is going to really speak to our audience. But first, I want to ask a couple of easier questions just to let people know a little bit about you. If you weren't in medical affairs, if you hadn't ended up in the career path that you're in now, what career would have been your runner-up?
Yeah, I think my alternative career might have been something totally different, like an architect. My parents used to like telling me I was obsessed with building things as a child. And somewhere along the way, I think I just fell into the natural footsteps of my family. My mom's a pharmacist, my dad's a physician. And so I kind of found my route following their footsteps over time. And so in an alternate universe, maybe an architect.
Well, yeah, you definitely followed in the parents' footsteps. It's a great mix of the two professions that you found yourself in. So I think that's really cool. My son also likes to build things, and we would like to push him into that architecture path because I love art and building. So I think that would be fun for him. So maybe we'll kind of push him for it. Maybe he'll end up in MSL.
You never know.
What's the best piece of career advice you've ever received, even maybe if you didn't fully appreciate it at the time?
I think it's pretty cliche to say, but take risks and take risks very early on. Part of the reason that I landed in pharmaceutical industry was actually by accident. I was working as a pharmacy technician in a hospital setting. And when I graduated, I came up to my boss and in my head, I naturally had this trajectory that, okay, now I'm going to just become this next hospital pharmacist as part of the department that I've already been working in. But fortunately and unfortunately, my boss said, you know what, we just hired somebody last week, so we don't have any positions available. And this kind of forced me to go down an alternative path of kind of self-discovery, what I want to do. I started having conversations with some other friends, and they introduced this concept of pharmaceutical industry to me. And so I randomly reached out to folks who already have experience within medical affairs across many different departments. So whether it was regulatory, operations, field medical, and by doing this, I kind of learned the way of the landscape through this path of self-discovery. And that's actually how I landed my first job at Pharma. One of the folks that I actually reached out to just for general career guidance came back to me and said that there's this contract level role. It would require totally moving to a different state. The pay is pretty bad relative to kind of the fair comp that pharmacists are used to. But it's a great foot in the door. And I said, you know what, let's take this opportunity. Let's take the risk. And that's exactly what I did. And that kind of set my trajectory up for the next several years to come. So I'm glad that I did that. So overall, I think risk taking is a piece of advice that I definitely put onto others.
That's a good one, especially stepping into this role that was maybe kind of unknown. It's gotten a lot of notoriety lately, but probably at the time, kind of a little bit of an unknown of what it is, what it involves, that sort of thing. So I think that's great advice. How about, so being in the MSL role, as long as you have been being in medical affairs, you've probably done a lot of travel and kind of faced how to keep your energy up, how to keep positive, how to keep moving. But if you could give busy MSLs one simple or realistic habit, or maybe a tip that you follow to keep your energy up while traveling, what would that be?
I think definitely try to get off the screen time. I mean, part of this job is you're constantly on your phone, the computer, on Zoom or Teams meetings. And so prioritizing a block on your calendar. So essentially it's just you time, or dedicating certain tasks in your own personal life that that would be interfering with last minute pop-up meetings that might overtake that schedule. That's really important. So I think priority number one is, if you know that you're typically busy on a certain day of the week, block out that time on your calendar. And I think that works quite well. The other life hack that I have is, as soon as you get to a hotel room after you travel, spend the next hour just decompressing. Don't force yourself in front of your computer to catch up on some work. Take a walk around the block, try to observe kind of where you are, take in the sights, because we do travel to some pretty remarkable places and cities, especially here in the United States. And so if you have the opportunity to really just see where you are and embrace it and take it all in, I think that's definitely a good life hack to start incorporating your daily habits.
I love the exploring part. A lot of people get so wrapped up in the role and the responsibilities and what you're there to do that they maybe don't take in the scene around them, like where the job has actually brought them. And a lot of folks that we talk to who are aspiring to get in the MSL role talk a lot about the travel piece, want to know how much is involved. Well, I love travel, but is this going to be too much travel or whatnot? But it really is such a unique job that puts you in some, like you said, some really beautiful places around the country that you may not have other opportunity to go to. So making good use of that and taking the time for yourself to decompress. I like that. I like that a lot. So you've kind of talked a little bit about your professional background, how you discovered the MSL role, and what kind of drew you to the MSL role. But why MSL versus other industry paths? What is the attractive piece for you in particular about medical affairs and the MSL role versus any other industry path you could have chosen?
Yeah, a lot of people that I speak to are always glorifying the medical science liaison type of role and how difficult that it is to kind of break in, which is definitely true. But another piece of advice I like to give back in return is, try your best to get experience in other alternative functions within medical affairs so you can truly understand what's working beneath the hood and all of those supportive functions that actually make an MSL a great MSL. And so when I first started, my first role was a medical information specialist, essentially a role where I help draft standard response letters, and help inquiries that come into our department from the physicians that intend to use or currently use our therapy. That gave me exposure into what we call a sister department, or a compassionate use department. Compassionate use is essentially, for those that don't know, a department that kind of reserves a bucket of therapy towards charitable uses. They give the drug totally free of charge. It's kind of an ethical contribution back to society. So for individuals that are not able to get reimbursed by their local insurance company, and they're consistently denied, there's kind of this Hail Mary last resort path that they can actually take to get the drug free of charge by appealing directly to the manufacturer of the company. And by doing that function, then I started to actually learn about what medical science liaisons were, what the importance of a field medical team is. And luckily, I had the opportunity, because one executive presentation I was giving that was in relation to the operations and compassionate use department I was working within, one of them came back to me and said, "Hey, you seem to be doing a pretty great job presenting data, communicating the data, establishing trust with your audience. I think you'd make a great MSL." And that's exactly how I kind of got that foray into the first role. So it was an interesting ride.
Interestingly, my pharmacy background was in one of those compassionate type roles where we worked with patient assistance programs and getting the patients their medications when insurance didn't cover it. They were thousands of dollars a month. They couldn't afford it, but they needed it. It was life changing or life sustaining medication for them. And so just hearing you talk about that, yeah, I definitely get that's meaningful work. Interesting how that trickles in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So looking back at your first MSL role, we have folks who enter medical affairs pre-COVID, so they have that experience from before things kind of changed and altered a little bit. And then some that came in post-COVID. But seeing how you've been in the MSL and medical affairs world for going on 10 years, what felt most challenging to you in those early days when you were just starting out as an MSL and everything was face-to-face, travel was the way things were done? What was the most challenging for you?
Yeah, I think there's a famous saying that Mike Tyson likes to say, which is, you always have a plan until you get punched in the face, right? And I think we all learned pretty quickly during COVID that the strategic plan, the expectations that you had, can all change on a flip of a coin, on a dime. And that's exactly what happened to our team. And so I was part of a company that launched a new innovative therapy for a rare disease. And it was a startup organization. We were doing it during COVID. And we quickly learned that the method of communicating to our target neurologists at the time was a lot more difficult. It took several months for kind of the world to adopt this new level of normal, that everybody would just hop onto their Zoom calls and have that level of interaction with their local MSLs. And so readapting, staying very adaptive to are the needs of your particular territory was very important. Another challenge that I actually experienced was with the first company that I joined. We were launching a first-in-class rare disease drug for a disease called myasthenia gravis, which is a rare neuromuscular disorder. And a drug had not been approved for this particular disease for over 6 decades, and we were the very first. And so when we initially came onto the scene, we thought that this would be a blockbuster drug where all of the physicians would adopt this as standard of care, that all of the insurance companies would start reimbursing this because this is clearly the only FDA-approved drug that's been in the market for the past 6 decades. Before this, it was really just symptomatic treatment. But we couldn't be more wrong. Insurance companies, unfortunately, implemented a clinical trial protocol that was a lot more stringent into what failures the patient had to endure with other therapies prior to starting ours. This was also the most expensive drug in the world at the time. And for those interested, it's called Soliris, Soliris. I believe when I first launched it, it was around $750,000 per year per life for patients. And now, thankfully, with new competitive therapies in the same market, it's quite saturated. And so the market economics start driving the price down. And so thankfully, there are a lot more options. But I think as the biggest learning lesson is always be prepared for scenarios B, C, and D, because you never know kind of what you're going to get hit with. And for us, it was definitely the insurance piece of things.
Gosh, that is astronomical from a price point. Very interesting to hear. And for listeners who are trying to break into medical affairs, we have a lot of followers of the podcast who are in that aspiring MSL position. What strategies or resources were most helpful for you? Or even if you're talking to people that are in those shoes today, what strategies or resources are you recommending today for people who are in those shoes?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question because I think that's the most often question that I actually get. How do I break into the MSL role? What do I need to do today that's tangible, that's going to make an impact? And for me, they're really just going back to what we spoke about earlier, which is create internal stepping stones. It's very easy to want to jump directly into the role that you see yourself in tomorrow, such as the MSL role, but having the experience with supportive roles that still work pretty collaboratively with MSL. So things like medical information, medical operations, utilize those opportunities as more of like an internship or residency. Any foray into pharmaceutical industry that actually gets you the experience, to be quite honest, whether it's paid or not paid, I think will reward itself in bounds ahead of what you actually expect. And so there are summer internships that several pharmaceutical companies create in terms of opportunities for postgraduates. There are residency programs and fellowship programs. That's something I would definitely look into. But overall, if you think that that's not for you or that's too competitive, you can still start as kind of this internal specialist the exact same way that I started. So medical information, there's also regulatory, there's pharmacovigilance, there's medical operations. There's so many different supportive functions that people don't tend to know about. And that'll definitely put you ahead of the curve because you already have the experience internally. You know how the dynamics work, the compliance boundaries work, and the cross-functional collaboration that's needed between MSLs and every other function within MedAffairs. So for me, that's the biggest piece of advice. Start internally and then start to go external from there.
And I'm so glad to hear you say that because that's some advice that we offer all the time. Don't neglect those stepping stone roles. Those can be huge. I know your ultimate goal is the MSL role, and what better goal is there? But there are other roles that can take you there just with patience and determination. And like you said, kind of getting in with those companies and coming from an internal perspective, because once you're a known entity with those companies, it might be a little bit easier to transition from a medical writing position or a medical information position or some of those other types of roles into a medical affairs position or MSL role rather, because you are a known entity. So I think that's such great advice. And I'm so glad to hear it from mouths other than our own. It's not just us as recruiters telling MSLs and aspiring MSLs that, but hearing it from somebody who's lived it and done it that route, that is a totally valid way of looking at things, of how to get to your ultimate goal. So thank you for sharing that. Well, so I want to kind of go back to something we just briefly touched on. And I kind of joked about how some aspiring MSLs say, well, I love to travel. And maybe that's their understanding of the MSL role. Now, most of them know more than that. But is there anything that you feel aspiring MSLs maybe misunderstand pretty commonly about the role before they're in it? So once they're actually in it, their eyes are open and they think, gosh, this is what it's really like. Is there anything like that that comes to mind?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a definitive difference between a sales rep and a medical science liaison. And to those that don't currently have experience in pharmaceutical industry, They tend to conflate the two. They think we're kind of one and the same, perhaps with a little bit of nuance, but we're entirely different functions. The way that I like to describe an MSL is that we're kind of like a sales rep with the same lifestyle. We travel a lot. We go to the physician's offices. We go to programs. We go to dinners, conferences. But the role of an MSL is not to sell the product, right? We don't make a commission. We're salary based. And that allows us to really focus on what impact we can provide in the field with establishing the relationships with our physicians. And so one key element of being an MSL is establishing those relationships that I mentioned, right? Physicians trust you, departments trust you, let's say institutionally. And the reason is they trust you is because you provide actionable data to them. You help them, you allow them to become better clinicians to provide better care for their patients. Understandably, if a physician treats not only, let's say, myasthenia gravis, they treat 30 different diseases, potentially more, and there's 100 different therapies to choose from, it's impossible for them to stay on track with all of the new therapeutic updates, clinical updates, data updates. Is there a new publication that came out to help educate on what's the standard of care today or what's potentially the next standard of care? And so that's part of your job, to really educate these physicians in the field. And in allowing them to understand information better, you're also learning from their practices. You're taking in what's called insights. And through those insights, you're bringing it back to the medical affairs team, and hopefully they're actionable. You create strategies around all of the conglomerate of insights that your entire national team takes in, and you're generating new data generation projects. You're creating what's called new investigator-initiated studies, because potentially there's a new research opportunity that's not really being focused on that your team can potentially fund. And this kind of drives the publication strategy forward and brings the advancement of the field in general forward. And so for me, the first stepping stone is to understand the nuance between sales and medical. And the second nuance is to really take that information, because it's not just about presenting data. It's about translating those field insights into actionable corporate strategies with tools that we use internally. And so the most common tool that you might hear about is something called Viva CRM. Another tool that's more of like AI generative is something called Sourcero, which is almost like the ChatGPT of medical insights. And so right now in the medical affairs field, we're utilizing a lot of different technologies to make our job more streamlined and easier, and to provide our impact forward to the field as best as we can.
That's a great explanation for those who maybe have just the baseline understanding of the role of what the difference is, what it looks like, and what the main objectives are of the MSL role. How about in your personal role? As you started, you started as an MSL. It sounds like you started on a contract team, so it was a little bit of a different position. So maybe your responsibilities looked a little bit different supporting a company. But how did your responsibilities and expectations change and evolve, or maybe even increase as you gained more experience, as you got more years under your belt?
I think it's important to manage expectations yourself about what the role needs to be today when you first become a medical science liaison versus what it needs to be in the future. And in itself, there's a bunch of stepping stones that you can kind of create to develop your skill sets, and how that evolves over time. And so, to provide a concrete example, when you first become an MSL, the obvious execution strategy is, okay, now I need to go out in my territory, go to the local institutions, the community docs, make myself known, make the company known, as well as the drug that we actually take care of here in the company, and just basically educate on the clinical data that's presented. Are they aware of the phase 3 trial? Are they aware that this drug may or may not be FDA approved? And this is kind of step number one, right? Awareness. Step number two is trying to find regionally, are there patterns that are starting to emerge in your local territory that's pretty consistent? Are there certain data gaps that's being focused on, that doctor number one is telling you that there's a data gap here, and doctor number two at this totally different institution is also kind of repeating that same thing? And so when you start to connect the dots and the patterns in your territory, you bring this back as an actionable insight, a potential data generation opportunity. And that's kind of step number two. That's the next evolution of MSL. How do you connect the dots to actually advance the disease state knowledge and awareness forward in a way that's tangible through actual data efforts, whether that's in relation to MRI findings, biomarkers, what we call HEOR studies or health economics and outcomes research. And number three is kind of bringing this all forward and actually making this kind of available on a national scale, right? So evolving it from regional to national. And for example, we did a case series at a previous company of ours. From a regional basis, we found consistent patterns of treatments and behaviors. And then we published a national case series across those multiple institutions. It's actually influenced a lot of different treatment paradigms across the entire nation at that point, because now there's definitive evidence of how physicians treat, why they treat, how should they treat. And so the more data that you can bring forth, the more impact that you have, not only on a regional basis, but national basis. And you can actually change the clinical paradigm of that particular disease state. And so it's quite an impactful role. You can be very hyper localized, or you can be broader on a national scale. So it is what you make it.
I want to switch gears a little bit. One question that you and I had talked about when we were discussing creating this episode was, did you ever envision yourself being a long-term MSL, or did those goals change over time? Your 5 to 10 year goal when you started out in medical affairs, has it changed or has it stayed pretty much the same?
I think it definitely changes over time. When I first started, I was very hungry for growth, and I think most people are when they first start. We all have this natural tendency to believe that, okay, if I'm in this role for X amount of years and I do my time, then I'm due for this next potential promotion or this next role because I deserve growth, right? Because in our head, we like to think of our career as very linear, but unfortunately, I don't think that's true. Right. So when I first started, I thought that, you know what, okay, I'm going to start internally, medical information. And then just by a stroke of luck, based on the needs of that department at the time, then I landed a compassionate use role, which is medical operations. And then again, without even understanding what the MSL role is, then I first got some exposure into field medical. I got lucky to land my first MSL role. And I personally thought to myself, you know what, let me do 2 years. And then, naturally, of course, I'll become regional director of the East Coast or the West Coast, and I'll have MSL direct reports because now I have that direct experience under me. But unfortunately, life just doesn't work that way. Growth, I think, comes when you're best suited for the role. And perhaps today is not that time, no matter what you might think it is. Do the best you can to leverage those skill sets, advance yourself that the next role actually needs and entails. And so for those interested in a medical science liaison kind of role, there's a very easy program you can join. One of them is called Toastmasters, which allows you to learn how to have better stage presence, present data, present stories in a much more communicable and tangible way, something that's palatable to the audience. So that definitely helped me a little bit. And the final thing is learn from mentors. People who are already doing the role that you want in the future, go out of your way to support them as much as you can. Because if you're always around them, making their job easier, they'll make your job easier in return, and they'll pull you ahead as their careers start to shift. So find a mentor. I think that's the biggest piece of advice that I could potentially give. And so going back to, did I expect where I am today from where I started 10 years ago? The answer is definitely no. I think I did the best to advance my skill sets and knowledge at the time. And so I did join a executive MBA program with an Ivy League university. And again, graduating from that program, this whole idea of like self-deservance, right? Like I deserve this next role because I just went through this program. I think life kind of like hits you in the face and humbles you in a little way to say, you know what, maybe you're taking it too fast. Take a little bit slow, and you're not quite ready for this next potential role because there's a lot left to learn. So I think just take it easy. Learn as much as you can from each individual role that you're in.
Yeah, those are excellent points. And I love that you brought up Toastmasters. I feel like that's an underutilized resource, an oldie but a goodie. But on that note, I would say also examine your whys. You may come in thinking, okay, career growth. I need to be an MSL for this many years, then an MSL leader, then, medical director, or whatever your goals are. And you think that it's just the next progressive step. But finding the role that you're most successful in, because we have had MSLs move into MSL leadership or one of these other types of growth roles, basically, and they just don't enjoy it. They miss being in the field. They miss that scientific exchange, that interaction. And so in that way, maybe constantly examine your goals. Is that that goal that I had 2 years ago, is that still my goal? And as you go through those mentorship relationships with people that are maybe in some of those roles, really feel them out, see what those roles involve. Some people say it's meetings upon meetings, it's meetings about meetings, it's all day of meetings. Is that really where you want to be? Do you want to be out of the scientific field and do the meetings, or do you really just want to foster and mentor people under you? I guess constantly reevaluate your why and what brings you meaning and fulfillment, and just make sure that your goals are aligned with that. But I think those are
Yeah.
great resources that you mentioned, great tips that you mentioned, the mentorship, Toastmasters, things like that, to better your craft and make sure that if those are still your goals, that you're arming yourself with the right tools to do that. So I think those are fantastic. And this may be kind of hitting on the same subject, but were there moments in your career where things didn't unfold the way you expected, or maybe kind of went out of your plan, but ended up in hindsight kind of getting you to where you are today? Are there moments like that that you can reflect on?
Yeah, you can never map out the next 5 years. Things always happen out of your purview, out of your expectation. And I think the most important thing to do is just go with the flow and don't have expectations. The only expectation that you should have is just to do your job and do it well. Enjoy what you do every day. Put your 100% forward. I know it's super cliche to say, but the reason I'm saying this is because when I first started at this startup company, Via Bio, we launched this product called Uplizna, which was the first potential FDA-approved B-cell depleter for a disease state called neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder, which is kind of an offshoot diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. I was in this startup environment, and we were incredibly excited to launch this first-in-class therapy for this, pretty rare disease. And then a year and a half later, we got an announcement that we would potentially get bought out from a much larger company at the time called Horizon Therapeutics. Horizon Therapeutics did not really have experience in the rare disease space. And so one expectation was don't expect to stay in the same company because things can change. Don't expect that you just launched a product and you're not going to have to relaunch that exact same product, because that's exactly what we did twice, because there was another acquisition from Amgen to Horizon Therapeutics where we did a relaunch essentially 3 times, a rebranded launch. I think the expectation thing is quite important. And the other piece is establish trust and credibility and relationships, not even just externally as a medical science liaison, but also internally. The people that you work with are hopefully people that you work with for a while, but the nature of pharma is that there's constant change, and it's important to be okay with change. And you'll see folks on your field medical team that might only be there for 1 year, 8 months, 2 years. And so it's almost like a revolving door of opportunity. How can you put your foot forward to mentor and guide the people that are relatively new to the role if you've been in there for quite some time with the exact same product, with the exact same company? And so you kind of elevate yourself and your skill sets to be more of like the father figure, the mentor role that you can guide them along the way. And I think that's really important. And that naturally steps up or paves the way for your next potential growth opportunity in that same company, because people have eyes, right? They always see what you're doing. They see the impact you're making, whether it's pretty evident or not. And so just always do your best. So that's kind of what I would say to that.
Yeah, medical affairs is a small, small world. Surprisingly so sometimes. We see it from the recruiting end that, especially when you break it down to therapeutic areas, disease states that people work in, everybody knows everybody. So it's to your benefit to mentor those under you and to, you know, keep those relationships friendly, even if it is that revolving door that you mentioned. You mentioned another thing, so it's a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk about next, the launching and relaunching, the revolving door. You have experienced a few acquisitions throughout your career,
Mhm.
so probably more than you would like and more than some people, but what was your first reaction the first time you went through one from start to finish? What were your thoughts when that was announced?
There's always a sense of hesitation and anxiety, I think, that comes with any acquisition, because with acquisitions, you typically hear one of two things. A company acquires you and all of a sudden people think that you're rich and all your stock vests. That's that's one thing that I typically hear, which is not the case. We can kind of talk about my experience there if you want. The second thing is the uncertainty behind, will you still have your job post acquisition? And so that's when it comes down to do your job and do it well, go with the flow and leave the uncertainty to the external world, because it's totally out of your control anyway. And if you're meant to stay in that role, you're going to stay in that role. Life will have their plans for you. For me personally, luckily, we're with a field medical team that was highly expertised in this one particular therapeutic area. It was an ultra rare disease. And so our team was essentially retained throughout both of those acquisitions. Naturally, you're going to have folks that leave to pursue other opportunities because, in this heightened sense of anxiety, they feel the need to kind of look elsewhere, and potentially there are better opportunities elsewhere depending on your circumstance. But in general, I like to stay optimistic and stay confident. And luckily, I live to tell the tale that even after 2 full acquisitions in only a span of 2.5, 3 years for the exact same product, I was still with that team until recently. I helped get repositioned into a role with the help of Symbio. And so that's one thing. I think heightened uncertainty, it's normal. It's okay. And it's almost like you watch the stock market go down. Don't sell into the panic. Just take a breather and just realize everything will be fine.
Yeah, that's such a great example, the stock market example. And, from the recruiting side, we do hear a lot of people like, oh, there's rumors of acquisition or this is coming through and I'm ready to start looking. And, we kind of give that same advice. Okay, you're you're getting that shock reaction. So let's have a conversation, let's talk, but you may end up okay, you may be retained. You kind of touched on this. Some people think their stocks may vest overnight, and so that's going to be a financial gain for them. And so they want to stick around and see. And some people are worried because that company that acquired their company may have their own team of MSLs. And so that person's role might become obsolete because they may be replaced by an existing team. So there's the fear, there's the hope both ways. For people who maybe haven't experienced an acquisition yet, or even those people who are aspiring MSLs, like, oh goodness, acquisitions, that's a topic I didn't even think about. What are
Mhm.
some common surprises similar to those, good or bad? What are some of the good things that can come from it, some of the bad things that can come from it?
Yeah, on the optimistic side of things, there's always going to be change. And so the opportunity to work with new people that might align more with your personality type, your culture, you might have a better natural fit. I think there's always opportunity to establish new relationships and establish new trust. And I think that's always the nice part. It's really a people's business, both internally and externally. The second thing to stay optimistic about is with an acquisition of a company, you're representing a brand new brand essentially, right? And so, does the new brand representation align with what you would like to represent yourself as? Because you are a field representative of this company that you work for. Is this new company aligned with how you want people to see you in the field with your interactions? There are other things to stay cautious about. With any acquisitions, the audit process, I think, definitely goes up. And so there might be existing processes, workflows, standardizations that you might be used to that might get thrown out the window and totally reframed and reworked. That's something that tends to have a high level of anxiety amongst folks because you might be very comfortable with one way of working, and all of a sudden overnight, this new company leadership team is going to tell you, let's kind of standardize it this way, the way that we've been doing it ourselves. And so be open to that change. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's not better. But oftentimes it's a learning curve. The new company, from my experience, does allow you, let's say, 3 to 6 months to slowly adapt into this new lifestyle, into this new ways of working, this new platform systems that they're using, to see if it actually meshes well with the team that they just acquired. And if not, there's always conversations to figure out how do we actually change it for the better. The third thing that is a huge part of our jobs as MSLs is to work with, as I mentioned, investigator-initiated studies. There's a lot of different acronyms thrown around, and they essentially mean the same thing: IITs, ISTs, ITTs, whatever it is, they're all really the same thing. And it's essentially where a physician has an idea that's not yet been studied. They want to use your team's resources, your team's therapy that you're actually promoting, and see if it's good for a totally different idea. So, a very low hanging example is, okay, let's see if albuterol, which we all know is used for asthma, let's see if it's good for diabetes or a totally different disease that we're all thinking like, maybe there's some scientific rationale, but we're not so sure. Well, okay, then you're going to actually work to establish a protocol. You're going to have budgetary requirements, a timeline, let's say over a year or 2 years. Now, if those studies were actually being conducted at your prior company and now post acquisition, there might actually be a reevaluation of those studies. Is it still worth pursuing and still worth, providing financial resources and the personnel and the staffing to actually ensure that this project sees to its completion? Sometimes studies get cut. And so that comes back to managing expectations with both internal projects as well as external relationships, because those KOLs that you work with are actually the ones that are authors on those investigator initiated studies. And so part of our role as MSLs is to manage expectations as a whole with the physicians that we tend to work with in the field. It's a relationship. Sometimes you have to be the presenter of bad news, but if you have a close sense of trust and credibility, they should understand, and your life and relationship moves on to the next thing. And so those are a few things I'd point out.
Yeah, I think these acquisitions can definitely change expectations, and you kind of talked a little bit how they can change the scope of your role, the responsibilities that maybe you're getting to do, and having to adapt to a new way of doing things. I wonder if you could speak to maybe how an acquisition for some people might change their expectations around their compensation or maybe their growth
Hmm.
opportunities. Maybe they're with a small and nimble pharma company that gets bought out by large pharma. So maybe those things look a little bit different. I wonder if you
Hmm.
have any experience or information on that you could share with folks who might be not in the know on that.
Yeah, with an acquisition, I think the complexity of the matrix teams you work with can start to change over time. And so if you work for a startup company, you definitely have to be more nimble, more flexible to do so many different types of projects and work that an MSL typically does not do. And so, I could tell you from experience now, we're very, very involved with the clinical development teams at our company, because the phase that that our drug is in right now is really hinged upon clinical trial enrollment, clinical trial activation, support, resource development there. And so that's something that we're responsible for now. But at a larger company, and if it's a post FDA marketed approved drug, maybe you're not going to really do those kinds of things. The other thing is involvement in things like advisory boards, and not even just medical, but commercial support, marketing support. You're doing a million different things at a startup company, but as you start to get acquired over time, the scope of your responsibility tends to get narrower. And I think that's normal. And so it really derives on what you want as an individual, as an MSL, and start to ask yourself, which environment do I thrive better in? And that's totally up to you, whether you want to work for a small or large pharma. The other thing that I would also say is performance metrics is a different thing. You might be used to having absolutely no metrics or KPIs as part of a medical team, to suddenly having to meet 20, 30, 40 email or live interaction expectations every single month. And your regional directors, your national directors, they typically aggregate these reports on a either weekly or monthly basis. They send it up the chain, and that's how they kind of assess the impact of their team on a more tangible basis, which I can totally understand. I think the largest question that's outstanding right now in a medical affairs team as a whole is how do we adequately assess the impact of an MSL? It's very easy to assess the impact of a sales rep, for example. We understand how many PEFs you got through, which is essentially scripts. We understand who's prescribing the medication in your territory. That's the impact you just had. But for an MSL, it's not really just about the number of engagements that you had. It's about what were the quality of those engagements? Did they generate any new insights that we've now taken in as a team, which helps us derive new data generation projects to advance the disease state as a whole? Did we have new IITs funnel out of your territory? Did we have involvement in broader programs like advisory boards, conference engagements? What does the level of sentiment look like in your territory? Has the type of understanding of the drug and disease state changed over time? There are a million different ways to kind of assess the evolution of your territory and your impact. And I think that will definitely be a guarantee that through every single acquisition I went through, it's what you're used to may no longer be the case moving forward. And the lowest hanging fruit of that is metrics, right? The expectations of how many interactions you need to have.
Yeah, I would say that rings true. We hear that a lot. And that's a big sticking point for a lot of people because they get so used to doing things the way they do things. And a lot of times these acquisitions do go small pharma becomes part of larger pharma. And so larger pharma usually has a set way of doing things. Not
Mhm.
always, but they sometimes come in with metrics that look very different from these smaller, more nimble companies where you do wear a lot of hats and you're doing a lot of different responsibilities. It becomes more structured. And so I think that rings so true that a lot of people have a hard time with that change in expectations of deliverables and what you're required to accomplish and how that can immediately just right off the bat kind of set some people's teeth on edge because it may seem unattainable or it may seem like a big ask from the company. And so I think that that's a really yeah, I like how you call it low hanging, but that is an easy one to kind of attach to and kind of draw attention to because that one is such a common one. These are great points. What advice would you give
Mhm.
to people who are finding themselves in the middle of an organizational change like this, some sort of buyout, acquisition, something like that? And so they may be a little fearful, maybe kind of finding themselves in a place where they have questions. Is there any advice that you would give to them through this?
Yeah, with change, unfortunately, as we discussed, a lot of things are out of your control, but what is in your control is the KOL relationships that you've had. And so I would say own your KOL relationships. Remind yourself that while internal structures, titles, managers, these things can all change, the credibility that you've established through your experience as an MSL in your career is really a portable asset that the company relies on during a transition, right? And that actually is what makes you a really viable candidate for other competitors that might emerge in the future. Your KOL relationships and your credibility is really the chip on your shoulder that separates you from other individuals as a medical science liaison. So I think that's definitely the biggest one. The second thing is identify the data gaps early if you can. I mentioned that part of your role as an MSL is to generate the insights, bring them in-house, see what sorts of research or publication projects you can start to work on. Through acquisitions, you're still going to be doing those types of things. And the earlier that you can make it known that you've identified data gaps or opportunities, companies like opportunities, especially if it moves the needle forward in disease state, it advances the therapeutic knowledge and awareness in the field. That's another thing, right? And so another low-hanging fruit kind of project you can do that I did in the past is something called a case series, right? Evaluate maybe treatment trends that have changed over time, prescribing habits from one old standard of care to your potential product, and see how that's kind of impacted the clinical quality of life of these patients over time. And I think the third point that I would note here is try to be a master of the new matrix that is now put forth in this new company. Instead of resisting new systems, try to promote yourself in positions that you did not have the opportunity to be in before. And so you're now a subject matter expert in a certain field. Become an SME for tools like an Insights lead generator or Viva or Sourcero, or a presentation deck builder of resources that your team can use. If you think that you're really good at one particular task, you have the opportunity to volunteer yourself essentially to be the lead for that task for the team. Or if you don't think that you're good at one particular task, and while things are shuffling around in the background for your new organization, maybe volunteer to support a team that you would like to get more experience in opportunities, or in times of change, I think is when the opportunities start to arise more often than not. And so it's up to you to capitalize on those opportunities to set yourself for the future. So I think that's what I would say.
That's fantastic advice. And interestingly, we start to hear a lot of hiring managers interviewing MSL candidates, asking questions like that. What were you the go-to person on your team for? What did your teammates look to you for? Value did you provide? And so, volunteering yourself as the person who, like you were saying, builds the slide decks, or, does all these other things, or pick something that you're really good at and you really enjoy. And that's what you throw yourself into constantly for your team. You become the go-to source of information for that. You become the go-to person. And so as your career evolves, it may not be a title that is on your resume, but it is something that you and your previous manager can attest to, that you were the go-to person on your team for that task. And so it's a selling point for your career, for yourself. It's something where you can build experience and become extra proficient, more than the common person might be. But I think being the go-to person for something, that's just invaluable. And looking for ways that you can volunteer in your team to kind of build your credibility and build your experience, I think that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we kind of just have a few more minutes here, but I wanted to talk about your career success and how that looks for you after being in the medical affairs and the MSL role for 8+ years now. How do you personally define career success at this stage of your career?
I think everybody has a definition of what career success means. For me personally, it's just really enjoying the craft that I do every single day. It's very easy to kind of fall into the mundane norm of what you typically do every single day, but it's also really up to you to make it exciting, to find new opportunities, to advance your knowledge, to advance your role, to advance your team. And so success to me looks like just doing the best job that I can. And, it's as simple as that.
I know there's a lot of MSLs out there who put the pressure on themselves to have everything figured out, to have their career mapped out, to have the role figured out from day one. There's just a lot of pressure that MSLs put on themselves to be at point Z on day one in a lot of ways. But what would you say
Yeah.
to MSLs who maybe put that pressure on themselves?
Part of our role is to manage expectations. And when I say that, it's important to manage your own. So there's a lot of pressure that you can put on yourself, put onto others, but they might be artificially induced. Like they might not actually be real pressures. And so control what's controllable. That's kind of where I would leave it. Sometimes it's just not beneficial or useful or valuable to keep these certain types of pressures on yourself, because it comes down to expectations. And so if you do your job the best way that you can, and you come with your best foot forward, and you try to support your territory, your team members, your entire organization as much as you can, that's not going to go unnoticed. And if you don't feel valued, and that pressure consistently builds where you don't feel like you're making an impact, you don't feel that you're valued, the reality is that nobody's forcing you to stay in this role. You kind of craft the reality that you want to live. Um, nobody has handcuffs on you. You can always look for a job elsewhere, but it is also an opportunity for you to reevaluate, what am I doing that can change, that I can do better? What am I doing that's right? And if I'm really doing everything that I can as best as I can, and I still do not feel fulfilled, it's totally up to you to change your reality. You can always shift teams, shift organizations, shift companies, and potentially there's a new opportunity for you to kind of reestablish yourself there. Now, I would say that's worst case scenario. I always say that do not do this as the first step number one. Do everything in your power to first fix where you're at today, whether it comes from internal or external. And if you're really at your wit's end, at the end of the day, just realize that you can always change.
And that's great advice, not just for MSLs, but even for aspiring MSLs, because they're coming from an industry that's not medical affairs, where, it's our parents' generation. You stay in a job for 20 years, you work there your whole life, you dedicate your life to that company. And in medical affairs, yes, you dedicate yourself to to that job, but at the end of the day, things happen, people move around, layoffs happen. It doesn't follow the pattern of other industries outside of medical affairs, basically. So there is that mindset that needs to shift for people, not just in the role, but looking to get into this role, that if you're in a position where you're undervalued, you're underutilized, it's just not a great fit, whatever, give it your all. But at the end of the day, if you tried everything to make it work, you can move around. You can go to another company. And if there's that acquisition, give it a chance, see what happens, see where the cards fall, and then you kind of reevaluate from there. But I think that's great advice for all aspects, whether you're in medical affairs or still wanting to get in. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. I just want to hit a couple of just quick rapid fire round here.
Let's do it.
Is there a habit or a mindset that's helped you navigate career uncertainty?
I think staying very organized. So one thing that the MSL rule has allowed me to do is everything has to be on my calendar. And that it rings true now for even my personal life. If somebody mentions an event or a task, if it's not on my calendar, I don't remember it 5 minutes later. And so stay organized. And I think that being organized will create a path for success for your job, because it really is all about time sensitivity in this game, especially when it comes to how fast the medical affairs field moves. And so, keep that calendar up to date every single day.
Organization. Fantastic. Is there a huge misconception that you feel people have about acquisitions in medical affairs?
A misconception through an acquisition, and this comes back to what I said earlier, is that all of a sudden you become rich overnight. And potentially you can. I've heard some examples where all of the stock vests the day that you get acquired instead of having to wait 4 years. And that price is at a premium because the company bought you out. Through my acquisitions, even though I've been through a few, we've had a different kind of structure where the stock that was previously available to the originating company, it just kind of integrates and gets grandfathered into the new company at a similar or different vesting schedule. It's not that you have this flood of money or flood of equity starting to be vested in day one. And so I think manage your expectations there. Every single organization is different.
Yeah. And last question here. Is there a piece of advice you'd give your younger self as you were entering your first ever MSL role?
I think stay optimistic and do your best to really create as much relationships internally as you are doing externally. The biotech world is so small and people always shift companies, and it won't be surprising to you when your old colleague or old boss goes to that company and pulls you forward for a next opportunity that opens up there. So always treat everybody with respect, with credibility, with kindness, because you never know who's going to pull you forward in the future.
Absolutely. Well, Johnathan, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today and for being so open about your journey. I personally think conversations like this are so important, especially in medical affairs where career paths rarely follow a straight line and change is usually a part of the experience. And what I really appreciate about your perspective is the reminder that you've given that uncertainty doesn't mean failure. It often means that there's growth potential. So just being mindful of that, not letting those moments of uncertainty scare you, but really kind of letting yourself examine it and see if it's going to be beneficial or give you more opportunities for growth. So whether someone's listening or just trying to break into the MSL role or navigating their first company transition, or maybe just thinking or rethinking what long-term success looks like for them, I hope this conversation has offered some clarity and maybe even a little permission for you to be flexible with your plan. To everyone listening, I'd love to hear your thoughts. There is a link in the show notes below. If you have questions or thoughts you want to share, we are always so happy to hear those. And if this episode resonated with you, or if you've experienced career transitions or acquisitions yourself, feel free to share your feedback or your questions with us. And as always, if there's a topic you'd like us to cover in the future on an episode of MSL 411, let us know. But Johnathan, thank you again so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being so generous with your time in the middle of an afternoon to speak with us.
No worries at all. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Linda.
And thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to share the link, let your friends know, and of course, connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you want more information on today's topic, please feel free to reach out. Be sure to check back soon as we continue to explore the topics that matter most to you in medical affairs.